Rostock, Germany, August 27th, 1939. The airfield trembled under a strange new sound. It wasn't the deep, rhythmic growl of a piston engine that engineers had known for decades. It was sharper, colder, the unbroken hiss of pure speed. On that grey morning, a small aircraft lifted off the runway, powered not by propellers but by a single jet of compressed fire. The plane was the Heinkel He-178, and with it, Ernst Heinkel had done what no one else on Earth had achieved. He had brought the jet age to life. Heinkel was no ordinary engineer. Born in 1888 in Grumbach, Germany, he had grown up fascinated by the impossible. While his classmates read books about farming or trade, he obsessed over flight, a science that, in the early 1900s, still belonged more to dreamers than to scientists. He studied mechanical engineering at the Technical University of Stuttgart, where he began building his own gliders out of wood and linen. His first designs failed spectacularly. One early glider crashed so violently that Heinkel nearly lost his leg. But failure only sharpened his conviction. Speed, he believed, was the key to progress. The faster humanity could move, the further it could evolve. By the time World War I erupted, Heinkel had already built his reputation as a bold designer. He joined Albatros Flugzeugwerke, where his seaplanes quickly earned respect from the Imperial Navy. His designs were fast, durable, and lethal. Yet Heinkel wasn't content to be just another engineer serving military orders. He saw aviation as art, a balance between structure and air, mathematics and imagination. Every aircraft, he once said, should be beautiful in its purpose. After the war, Germany was forbidden from developing military aircraft under the Treaty of Versailles. Many engineers fled abroad or switched careers, but Heinkel refused to stop building. He moved to Rostock on Germany's northern coast and founded Heinkel Flugzeugwerke in 1922. Publicly, he produced small civilian seaplanes. Secretly, he continued to experiment with speed, power, and new forms of propulsion. He surrounded himself with a new generation of daring young engineers, many barely out of university, who shared his obsession with breaking limits. By the early 1930s, Germany's politics was shifting. The Nazis rose to power, promising jobs, pride, and, crucially, the rebirth of military aviation. Heinkel, always more fascinated by machinery than ideology, saw opportunity. With government contracts pouring in, his company began designing the aircraft that would rebuild Germany's air force, the He-70 Blitz, a sleek, streamlined mailplane capable of unprecedented speed. The Luftwaffe took notice. Soon after, Heinkel's factories began producing bombers. Machines like the He-111, which would become infamous over the skies of Spain and later London. To Heinkel, these were not weapons. They were proof of what German engineering could achieve. But while others saw politics, he saw physics. In his workshops, he began pushing for something radically new, a plane that could fly without propellers. Conventional engines had reached their limit. The drag of propeller blades, the vibration, the inefficiency, it all frustrated him. Somewhere he was convinced there had to be a cleaner, faster way to conquer the air. He hired a young engineer, Hans von Ohain, who arrived with a revolutionary idea, the turbojet. Instead of turning a propeller, air would be compressed, mixed with fuel, and ignited in a constant stream of thrust. The principle was simple. The challenge was to make it real. Most in the aviation world dismissed it as fantasy. But Heinkel wasn't most engineers. He gave von Ohain a small team, a secret hangar, and total freedom. For years they worked quietly, testing prototypes, melting metals, and breaking turbines. Then, on that morning in August 1939, their persistence took flight. The Ha-178, small, stubby, almost fragile-looking, screamed down the runway and lifted into the air. The flight lasted barely 6 minutes, but those 6 minutes changed everything. It was the dawn of a new era. When the test pilot landed, he climbed out pale, trembling, and stunned. "It's like being pushed by a ghost," he said. And yet, no one outside Heinkel's circle knew what had happened. Germany was days away from invading Poland. The world would soon drown in war. The news of the first jet flight, an event that should have transformed science, was buried by the noise of history. Heinkel didn't care. In his mind, the He-178 wasn't just an experiment, it was proof that the future had already arrived. He believed the age of jets would make propeller aircraft obsolete within years. What he didn't realize was that his creation, meant to transcend war, would soon become one of its deadliest tools. Because the same government that funded his dreams would demand his genius for destruction. And Heinkel, ever loyal to engineering before morality, would obey. If you're fascinated by forgotten innovations that reshaped our world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. More true wartime stories are coming. Was Heinkel a visionary who changed history, or a man who sold his soul for speed? Rostock, Germany, 1936. The air over the Baltic coast smelled of fuel and salt. The hangars of Heinkel Flugzeugwerk were busier than ever. Engineers worked 16-hour days. Assembly lines ran under floodlights, and in the distance, freshly painted aircraft roared off the runway, with the black cross of the Luftwaffe on their wings. What had begun as a modest civilian factory was now one of Nazi Germany's most important industrial strongholds. Ernst Heinkel had achieved what few engineers could dream of: total creative power, backed by the full resources of a nation preparing for war. Heinkel saw himself not as a servant of politics, but as a servant of speed. His aircraft were the sharp edge of progress. When Hermann Göring's air ministry demanded new bombers, Heinkel responded with elegance and efficiency. His He-111 bomber, originally designed as a commercial mail plane, became a masterpiece of aerodynamics. Smooth, rounded, and deceptively beautiful. Its twin engines gave it range and endurance far beyond its competitors. By 1937, it was the backbone of Germany's growing air power. To Heinkel, the He-111 wasn't a symbol of aggression, it was a technical triumph. The perfect expression of design meeting purpose. But in the skies over Guernica, Spain, that purpose turned dark. During the Spanish Civil War, German pilots of the Condor Legion used Heinkel's aircraft to bomb civilian targets for the first time. Villages burned, cities were flattened, and a generation of Spanish civilians learned what total war meant. The He-111, sleek and graceful on the runway, became a weapon of terror. When reporters later called it the steel vulture of Guernica, Heinkel dismissed the criticism. "The airplane is not to blame for how men use it," he said. To him, war was just the testing ground of innovation. If his machines proved superior, they justified themselves. By 1938, Heinkel's company employed more than 20,000 workers. New factories rose across Germany, their chimneys feeding a growing storm. Heinkel himself became wealthy and respected, often dining with high-ranking Nazi officials. But inside his office, framed photographs of his early seaplanes still hung on the wall. Reminders that his love for flight had begun long before politics. Yet he couldn't ignore what was happening around him. His engineers were being pressured to produce faster bombers, heavier payloads, longer ranges. The Luftwaffe demanded machines capable of striking London, Warsaw, and Moscow. When Heinkel complained about the rushed production schedules, Göring's answer was cold. Germany does not wait for perfection. Germany conquers. Heinkel pushed on. He developed the He-100, a record-breaking fighter that reached over 746 km/h, faster than anything in the sky at that time. But internal politics killed the project. The Air Ministry favoured Messerschmitt's designs, and Heinkel's fighter was quietly shelved. The rejection enraged him. His obsession with speed turned personal. If the military didn't want his fighters, he would build something so advanced that no one could ignore him again. In secret, he returned to his jet project. The He-178 had proven that jet propulsion was real, but now he wanted a combat-ready version. A jet fighter that could outfly every propeller-driven plane on Earth. Heinkel's engineers began drawing blueprints for the He-280, the world's first operational jet fighter. It would have swept wings, twin engines, and an ejection seat, a concept decades ahead of its time. As war erupted in 1939, Heinkel's factories became military fortresses. The He-111 bombers led the assault on Poland, and months later on London during the Blitz. Each night, waves of Heinkel aircraft crossed the Channel, dropping explosives that shattered cities and spirits alike. Heinkel watched their flight paths on military maps. Not with pride, but with a detached fascination. The precision of the routes, the timing of the raids, they were proof that his machines worked. Still, he couldn't escape the contradictions of his own genius. The man who dreamed of conquering the skies now found his aircraft reducing them to ash. He was both the creator and the destroyer, and as the Reich expanded, so did his unease. When war correspondents visited his Rostock plant, Heinkel avoided politics entirely. "I'm an engineer," he would say. "I build for the future." But by 1941, the future he was building for was drowning in smoke. The same aircraft that had brought him fame now bound him to a regime that used science as a weapon. Yet deep inside his laboratories, something revolutionary was taking shape. A jet fighter that could have rewritten the air war. As the bombs fell and empires clashed, Heinkel's engineers worked in secrecy to bring that machine to life. Could an engineer's vision for progress ever survive when war demanded only destruction? Vienna, 1942. Snow covered the airfield where a new kind of aircraft stood under guard. It had no propellers, no familiar rumble, no vibration. Just two smooth nacelles mounted under its wings, twin jet engines ready to breathe fire. This was the Heinkel He-280, the world's first operational jet fighter, and Ernst Heinkel knew that if it flew as expected, it could change the war. When the engines ignited, the sound was unlike anything the Luftwaffe officers had ever heard. A deep, continuous roar that shook the ground but not the air. The He-280 accelerated fast, too fast. It lifted effortlessly, slicing through the winter sky like a bullet. For a few brief minutes, Heinkel believed he had achieved what no other nation had, total air superiority through technology. But the triumph didn't last. The German High Command, obsessed with existing designs like the Messerschmitt Me-109 and Me-262, dismissed the He-280 as too experimental. Heinkel was furious. His engineers had proven the jet concept, yet politics once again strangled innovation. He had wanted to build the future. The ministry wanted to win the present. Heinkel's obsession deepened. He spent nights in his office studying blueprints, calculating thrust-to-weight ratios by hand. The He-280, with its clean lines and retractable landing gear, was already years ahead of its time. But while he refined his jet fighter, Germany's war effort began to collapse. The Allies bombed his factories in Rostock, his test facilities in Vienna, and even his own home. Every time a bomber formation appeared on the horizon, it was often a squadron of British Mosquitoes, aircraft made of wood, designed by Geoffrey de Havilland, Heinkel's rival in both war and philosophy. Heinkel's dream of pure engineering was dissolving under the weight of war. The Luftwaffe was losing control of the skies, and desperate orders poured in for a new miracle weapon, fast, cheap, simple to build. From that chaos was born the He-162 Volksjäger, the people's fighter. It was a jet designed not for trained pilots, but for teenagers. Built with plywood, powered by a single BMW turbojet, the He-162 was meant to be Germany's last hope. Heinkel engineers worked around the clock, assembling prototypes in cold, dark hangars as Allied bombers pounded German cities into rubble. The aircraft was dangerously unstable, rushed into production without proper testing. Yet in January 1945 it flew, sleek, fast, and lethal, but too fragile to matter. Heinkel stood beside the runway during one of its test flights, the air thick with smoke from distant bombings. The jet screamed overhead, its silhouette cutting through the clouds like a ghost of what might have been. Then, suddenly, a wing tore off mid-turn. The aircraft spiraled into the ground. The pilot, one of Heinkel's best, never stood a chance. Heinkel didn't speak. He turned away from the wreckage, his face pale, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had wanted to prove that technology could save his country, that innovation could rise above politics. Instead, his genius had been consumed by a machine of death. By early 1945, as the Reich crumbled, his factories were ruins. Allied bombers had erased decades of work. His engineers were scattered or dead, his records destroyed. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he still believed the jet engine was humanity's destiny. In the closing months of the war, Heinkel's name vanished from German newspapers. His achievements, once celebrated by the regime, became irrelevant as Berlin fell. The Me-262, a design he had helped inspire, entered combat first, stealing the title of the world's first jet fighter. For Heinkel, it was a final humiliation. He had built the foundation of the jet age, but someone else would wear the crown. When American and Soviet troops stormed through Germany, both sides hunted for engineers, blueprints, and technology. Operation Paperclip began in the west. Soviet teams advanced in the east. Heinkel's work, scattered across bombed-out hangars, was seized, studied, and absorbed into the research programs that would soon define the Cold War. Heinkel himself was arrested, interrogated, and held under suspicion of war crimes. But the Allies quickly realized he had never been a Nazi by conviction, only by necessity. He was released, stripped of his factories and his fortune, but alive. In his private notes, written just after the war, Heinkel reflected on his life's work. The airplane is born from curiosity, but when curiosity serves power, it becomes a weapon. I only wanted to make things fly faster. For a man who had once chased the horizon, the silence of defeat was unbearable. If you believe progress can't exist without risk, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Or more forgotten engineers are coming soon. Did Heinkel build the future too early, or did the world simply arrive too late to understand him? Rostock, April 1945. The sound of war no longer came from the skies. It came from the streets. The grinding of tanks, the collapse of concrete, the panic of a nation being erased. The factories that once produced Germany's most advanced aircraft were now piles of twisted steel and ash. Smoke hung above the Baltic coast like a shroud. Ernst Heinkel, once celebrated as a national hero, stood in the ruins of his empire, watching his life's work dissolve into dust. The Allied bombing campaigns had been relentless. For months, waves of Lancasters and flying fortresses had targeted his production plants. The runways were cratered, hangars burned, blueprints scattered like leaves. When the war began, Heinkel had more than 20,000 workers. By its end, barely a few hundred remained. Engineers without machines, mechanics without wings to repair. The Luftwaffe was finished, its wonder weapons too late to matter. The collapse came fast. Soviet troops were pushing in from the east, and the Americans were already in Bavaria. Heinkel's name appeared on Allied lists of industrial collaborators. Amiralande de la Claren, men whose technology had sustained the Nazi war effort. He was arrested in May 1945, interrogated first by the British, then by the Americans. The questions were always the same. How advanced were your jet projects? How far did your research go? Heinkel told them everything. He spoke of the He-178 and the He-280, the birth of jet propulsion. And the experiments that could have changed the war had politics not interfered. The Allies were shocked by the depth of German engineering. Many of the captured documents and prototypes would later form the foundation of both American and Soviet jet programs. In a cruel irony, the same ideas that had been born in the ruins of Rostock would soon power the Cold War. For Heinkel, the interrogations were both punishment and validation. He had always believed science belonged to no nation. Now, stripped of everything, he was witnessing his own philosophy play out. His inventions adopted by the very enemies he had once built to destroy. When the war officially ended, Heinkel was released. He was not a member of the Nazi Party's inner circle, and no direct evidence tied him to war crimes. Yet his reputation was shattered. The name Heinkel no longer meant innovation, it meant complicity. His factories were seized, his assets confiscated, his company dissolved. Germany was unrecognizable. The country that had once fueled his dreams was now divided by barbed wire and ideology. Heinkel returned to his hometown under Allied occupation, a man without a workshop, without a purpose. For the first time in decades, he was forced to stop building. The silence tormented him more than the interrogations ever had. In 1948, he tried to rebuild. With restrictions on aircraft production still in place, he turned to manufacturing bicycles, motor scooters, and small cars, products of necessity rather than ambition. The Heinkel cabine, a tiny bubble car built for a starving post-war Germany, was a shadow of his earlier creations, but it kept his company alive. The man who had once built bombers now built vehicles for families trying to forget the war. Despite everything, Heinkel refused self-pity. He was pragmatic to the end. When asked in a rare interview about his feelings toward the regime he had served, he replied quietly, "I worked for my country, the others worked for their ideology." To him, engineering was amoral, a discipline of facts, not beliefs, but history would never see it that way. By the early 1950s, Heinkel was an old man, haunted by what he called the weight of invention. He had helped birth the jet age, but lived long enough to see it transformed into the engine of nuclear bombers and supersonic warplanes. The technology he dreamed would unite mankind was now dividing it faster than ever. He still sketched in his notebooks designs for faster aircraft, safer wings, quieter engines, but few cared. The world had moved on to new heroes, new nations, and new frontiers. The name Heinkel was now a footnote in the story of aviation, overshadowed by von Braun, Messerschmitt, and Lockheed. And yet, every time a jet cut across the clouds, its sound carried an echo of that first flight in 1939. The moment when one man's obsession with speed unlocked the future. History had condemned Heinkel for his obedience, but even his critics admitted the truth. Without him, flight would never have been the same. Can a man's inventions outlive the morality of the time that created them? Hamburg, 1958. The sky above northern Germany was filled once again with the sound of engines. Not bombers this time, but airliners. Sleek, silver, and peaceful. They crossed the same airspace that once burned with war. In a small office near the port, Ernst Heinkel, now 70 years old, sat by the window, listening to that sound with mixed pride and regret. He had spent a lifetime chasing speed, and the world had finally caught up. The jet age he once dreamed of was now reality. But it belonged to others. In post-war Europe, Germany's aviation industry had been dismantled and forbidden from military production. Heinkel tried to adapt. His small car, the Heinkel cabine, became a symbol of post-war survival. Cheap, practical, and light. It was a far cry from the sleek bombers and jet prototypes of his past, but it kept his company alive and his engineers employed. To many Germans, Heinkel had gone from war industrialist to builder of hope. To others, he remained a man whose machines had fueled destruction. Heinkel himself rarely spoke about politics. When journalists visited him, he preferred to talk about metallurgy, turbine compression, and airflow. He insisted that engineering was neutral, that the machine itself had no morality, but time was proving him wrong. His name appeared in books and reports that linked him to the militarization of science under the Third Reich. Universities stopped inviting him to speak. His contributions to flight, from seaplanes to the world's first jet, were overshadowed by the ghosts of the He-111. Still, progress did not erase him entirely. In 1955, the ban on German aircraft design was lifted. Heinkel returned to aviation for one final attempt. He founded Heinkel Flugzeugbau GmbH, focusing on small jets for civil use. his engineers began work on the Heinkel HE-201 and HE-162 derivatives adapted for trainers. But the era had changed. Germany was no longer a nation of inventors racing toward the future. It was a country rebuilding its conscience. Heinkel's designs, though innovative, failed to find investors. Jet aviation had moved on to giants like Boeing and de Havilland. His company was acquired by Messerschmitt Blohm in the early 1960s. The man who once symbolized the cutting edge of speed quietly stepped out of the spotlight. When he retired, Heinkel wrote a memoir that few ever read. In it, he described his lifelong fascination with motion, not power. "Speed is not destruction," he wrote. "It is discovery. It is proof that we can rise above what holds us down." Yet the irony was impossible to escape. His pursuit of speed had armed one of history's most brutal regimes. Heinkel died in January 1958, the same year commercial jetliners entered service across Europe and America. The sound of the engines outside his window that winter carried his legacy, not in name, but in principle. The smooth thrust of the turbines, the streamlined fuselages, the aerodynamic precision, all traced back to his early experiments with jet propulsion. Decades later, historians would revisit his work with a more nuanced eye. Without Heinkel's risk-taking, the jet age might have arrived a decade later. Without his ambition, engineers like von Ohain and Whittle might have lacked the industrial support to make their ideas fly. And without his factories, Germany's aviation renaissance might never have taken shape at all. But the moral paradox remains. Heinkel's story is not just about invention. It's about the cost of invention. Can genius remain pure when it serves the ambitions of a dictatorship? Can progress exist without responsibility? Today, his aircraft stand in museums. The He-111 in London, the He-178 in Munich, the He-162 in Washington. Tourists look at them with curiosity, not fear. Few recognize the man who made them. The logo that once adorned the wings of terror now rests behind glass, silent, like a relic of a world that learned too late that technology alone cannot save humanity. Heinkel once said he wanted to build machines that could make mankind faster, freer, and fearless. He succeeded, but not in the way he imagined. Because the truth of progress is this: every breakthrough carries both light and shadow. And maybe, just maybe, the future Heinkel dreamed of was never about flying faster, but about learning how not to fall again. Was Ernst Heinkel a genius who unlocked the jet age, or a warning of what happens when innovation forgets its conscience?